My name is Nadia Okafor. I'm 32 years old and I've spent the last 7 years building something from nothing. A financial forensics practice that three of the largest federal agencies in this country now call when they can't figure out where the money went. But on the morning of September 4th, standing in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Whitmore Capital Group, I wasn't a forensic accountant with a federal clearance. I wasn't anything. I was just my father's daughter. And to the 12 people sitting around that table, that was all I would ever be. My father cleared his throat. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He looked at the ceiling, the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "I've reviewed the candidate files personally," he said, "and I made the decision to table Nadia's application for the senior analyst position. She lacks the institutional experience this role requires." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of disagreement. The hollow quiet of people deciding whether to pretend they hadn't heard. I had submitted that application 6 weeks earlier. I had done everything right. The portfolio, the case summaries, the 3 letters of recommendation from people whose names made partners at this firm straighten their spines. I had not told anyone I was applying. I had not asked for help. I had wanted it to stand on its own. But my father was the managing director of the entire division, and the only thing he'd ever given me without strings attached was his last name. He finally looked at me then. 1 second, maybe less. The kind of look you give a misplaced file before you move on to the next item on the agenda. I didn't flinch. I'd been preparing for this moment for longer than he knew, not to fight it, to use it. What they didn't know was that I had not come to Whitmore Capital for a job. I had come because 14 months earlier, a whistleblower named Cora Ng had walked into the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit with a hard drive, a stack of printed ledgers, and a name she kept repeating: Whitmore. The Bureau had passed her case to a contractor. The contractor had passed it to me. Cora was 26. She had worked in Whitmore's internal audit department for 2 years before she noticed the pattern: a series of quarterly transfers, always under the federal reporting threshold, always routed through 3 holding entities in Delaware before landing in an account no one could trace on paper. She had flagged it to her supervisor. Her supervisor had flagged her as a performance risk. 2 weeks later, she was gone. I had spent 4 months living inside that hard drive. I knew the account structure the way you know the floor plan of a house you grew up in. I knew which transfers matched which client portfolios. I knew which senior partners had signed off and which ones had been kept deliberately blind. And I knew my father's initials appeared on 6 of the authorizing documents. I had reported this to the Bureau quietly. I had given them what they needed. And then, when the supervising agent told me the investigation required someone on the inside, someone who could access the physical files before a formal warrant triggered a document purge, I volunteered. I knew the risk. I also knew my father would never suspect me. He had never taken me seriously enough to fear me, so I submitted the application. I used my real name. I let him reject me in front of 12 witnesses. Because the thing about a man who underestimates you is this: he never checks what you're carrying when you walk into the building. The badge they gave me was a contractor pass. Temporary. Limited to floors 2 through 5. I had what I needed on floor 11. My handler, a bureau agent I'll call Warren, because that wasn't his name, had positioned me with the consulting assignment reviewing third-party vendor invoicing discrepancies. It was the kind of work that made people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties. It also gave me a reason to request document access that no one questioned, because no one thought vendor invoicing was interesting enough to lie about. On my 3rd day, I requested a records transfer from the archive room on 11. Standard procedure: fill out the form, cite the audit reference number, wait 48 hours. The request was denied. No explanation. Just a red-stamped return slip in my inbox. I submitted it again, through a different protocol channel citing compliance review guidelines. Denied again. On the 5th day, I found a different route: a standing policy that allowed external consultants to cross-reference physical records against digital audit logs in cases of documented discrepancy. I filed a discrepancy report. I documented it properly. It was 4 pages of careful, accurate, completely unremarkable language that cited a $47 variance in a 2019 vendor invoice. The records room opened to me on day 7. I had 2 hours. I used 93 minutes. I photographed what I needed with a device the size of a pen cap, and I walked out holding a takeout coffee from the lobby cafe like I had nowhere important to be. That evening, I uploaded everything to Warren. He called me 12 minutes later. "This is it," he said. "I know," I said. "We can move within 30 days. Give me 45. There's one more thing I need." The one more thing was a woman named Opal Tran. She was a junior analyst in the compliance department, 24 years old, straight out of a master's program at Georgetown. Sharp, methodical, and, I had noticed in my second week, systematically being excluded. Her reports were reassigned to senior analysts before they reached the partners. Her name disappeared from the summary documents. In meetings, her contributions were absorbed without attribution, like water into sand. I recognized it, not because it was subtle, because I had watched my father do the exact same thing to me for most of my adult life. I found her in the stairwell on a Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting on the steps between floors 3 and 4, eating a granola bar and reading something on her phone. She looked up when I pushed through the door, ready to apologize for being somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. I sat down 2 steps above her. "I saw the Kellerman analysis," I said. "The one that ended up in Donovan's presentation last week." She went very still. "That was his project. It had your methodology in section 4, the attribution gap in the derivatives table. That's not a coincidence." She looked at me for a long moment. "Are you here to tell me to let it go?" "No," I said. "I'm here to ask if you documented it." She had. She pulled up a chain of internal emails on her phone, drafts she'd saved but never sent, with timestamps that predated Donovan's presentation by 11 days. Her analysis, her conclusions, her language. Right there. I handed her my notebook. "Write your name, today's date, and the Kellerman project reference number. Then I'm going to sign underneath it." She looked at the notebook and then at me. "Why would you do that?" I didn't answer the way she was expecting. I just said, "Because someone did it for me once, and it changed everything." She wrote her name. I signed underneath it. As she left, I stayed in the stairwell for a moment. I thought about the morning my father had looked at me across that conference table and decided I didn't exist. I thought about all the other mornings like it, going back 20 years. The science fair he didn't attend, the law school acceptance he called a backup plan, the forensics practice he described to his colleagues as something she does with spreadsheets. I had spent years wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, what version of myself might have finally been enough. I had stopped wondering about 3 years ago when I read a case file about a 16-year-old girl who had aged out of foster care, learned to code on library computers, and built a fraud detection algorithm that recovered $82 million in stolen Medicare funds. She had not done it to be seen. She had done it because it needed doing. I put her file up on the wall above my desk. Not as inspiration, as a reminder. The work is the point, not the recognition, not the validation, but accountability. That's different. Accountability. That's different. Accountability isn't about ego. It's about consequence. And consequence was coming. In my 5th week at Whitmore, my father called me into his office. It wasn't a large office for someone of his position. He had always preferred function over signal, bare walls, a single-framed photo of himself shaking hands with a senator, a desk that faced the door so he could see everyone who entered before they saw him properly. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "Please," I said. "Your work here has been adequate. The vendor audit is on track." He paused. "But I want to make sure we're clear that the contractor arrangement ends at 90 days. There's no path to a permanent position. I think you understood that when you applied." I looked at him for a moment, at the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the careful neutral of his expression. He had been performing competence my entire life. I had spent most of my life trying to earn something from that performance. "I understood exactly what I was walking into," I said. He nodded once, satisfied that we had reached an understanding, and turned back to his screen. I stood up. "One more thing," I said. "The Delaware transfers. Accounts 7714, 7714, and 7718. I said the numbers slowly, the way you read coordinates to someone who needs to write them down. Someone should look at those before the end of the quarter. I watched him, his hands on the keyboard stopped. Not a flinch, not quite. More like the pause before a man decides which direction to run. I left before he could answer. The next morning, I arrived at 7. The lobby was quiet, the security desk unmanned for the 4 minutes between shift changes. I took the elevator to 11, used the temporary code Warren had provided through our back channel, and retrieved the last 2 physical documents I needed from the records room. At 9:15, I sat down at my desk on the 3rd floor and sent Warren a single message. Ready. At 10:40, 2 federal agents and a compliance officer from the Securities and Exchange Commission walked through the front doors of Whitmore Capital Group. They did not come to my floor. They went directly to 11. By noon, 4 senior partners had been asked to surrender their devices. By 2 o'clock, the glass-wall conference room on the 14 was occupied by people with federal badges and boxes of documents. I kept working. Vendor invoicing. Third-party discrepancies. The ordinary machinery of the work I had been assigned. At 3:15, Opal appeared at the edge of my cubicle. Her face was carefully blank, but her eyes were doing the thing eyes do when someone is recalibrating everything they thought they understood about where they were standing. "Did you know this was going to happen?" she asked. "I knew something was going to happen," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "The notebook," she said. "You needed my name on record." "I needed your testimony to be protected before the building got complicated," I said. "Whatever you saw in that Kellerman project, you're going to be asked about it. And when you are, you'll have documentation that predates everything else." She exhaled slowly. "Who are you?" It was the same question Fisher had asked Sarah in the story I'd been thinking about since I was 12 years old, the underdog story, the ghost who came back. Except this wasn't a story. It was a Tuesday. "Someone who did the work," I said. "Same as you." My father was escorted out at 4:47 in the afternoon. Not in handcuffs, not yet. Just 2 agents, one on each side. A courtesy that men of his position are sometimes still extended even when they have forfeited the right to it. He was carrying his jacket over his arm. His face was the face of a man who had prepared for many outcomes, but not this one. He saw me as they passed. I was standing at the end of the hall, not blocking his path, not performing anything. Just there. Present. The way I had been present at every dinner table where he dismissed me, every phone call where he redirected conversations about my career to something less embarrassing, every Christmas where he introduced me to his colleagues as, "My daughter, she does something in accounting." He stopped walking. The agents paused on either side of him. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in the conference room on September 4th, except this time, there was nothing on his face like dismissal. There was something older, something I recognized from a photograph I'd seen once, of a much younger version of him, before he became the kind of man who chose power over everything else. He didn't speak. I didn't need him to. I held his gaze for exactly as long as it took for him to look down. Then the agents moved, and he moved with them, and the hallway was quiet again. Opal's name was restored to the Kellerman project file within 2 weeks. The compliance review confirmed the attribution discrepancy and issued a formal correction. Donovan resigned before the review was complete. Warren called me on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the building. 6 counts, he said. Securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction. The Delaware accounts go back 11 years. "What about the junior partners?" I asked. 2 cooperating, 1 contesting. Your father is not cooperating. I already knew that. He would not cooperate. He had never in his life admitted to being wrong about anything, not to me, not to anyone. What he would do, what I had always known he would do, was choose silence. Controlled, deliberate, carefully managed silence. That was fine. I had not done any of this to hear him confess. I had done it because Cora Eng had walked into a federal building with a hard drive and a name she kept repeating, and she had deserved better than to be filed and forgotten, because Opal Tran had done the work and watched her name disappear, because somewhere in the structure of Whitmore Capital Group, in the Delaware transfers and the redacted ledgers, and the 6 authorizing initials, there were real people who had lost real money that was supposed to protect them. Pension funds, municipal accounts, a teachers' union in Ohio, a hospital foundation in rural Kentucky. They were the reason. My father was just the door I had to walk through to get to them. 3 months later, I was back in a conference room. Different building, the field office in downtown DC. Smaller, fluorescent lit, no glass walls. Warren was there, and 2 senior agents I hadn't met before, and a woman named Dr. Angela Pershing from the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Unit, who shook my hand with the particular grip of someone who has spent decades in rooms full of people who underestimated her. She slid a single-page document across the table toward me. It was a commendation letter. Department of Justice letterhead. My name at the top. I read it once, carefully. Then I looked up. "There's a formal role," Dr. Pershing said. "We've been building a civilian forensic advisory unit for 3 years. We need someone who can operate independently, who already has federal clearance and who understands how these structures work from the inside." She paused. "You understand them better than anyone we've found." "Because I grew up inside one," I said. She didn't flinch at that. I appreciated it. "Yes," she said simply. I looked at the document again. My name on Department of Justice letterhead. The work I had been doing quietly, in contractor assignments and back channels and stairwells with junior analysts who needed someone to sign their name beneath theirs, now on paper, acknowledged official. I thought about my father signing those authorization documents, his initials, 6 times, on transfers he had to have known were wrong. I thought about all the years he had looked at me and seen an inconvenience, a liability, something to be managed. I thought about Cora Eng, who had walked in with a hard drive and changed everything. I signed the document. I did not attend my father's arraignment. I was in Kentucky that week, meeting with the Hospital Foundation's board of directors to begin the process of documenting their losses for the recovery proceedings. The foundation's CFO, a woman in her late 50s who had been fighting that fight alone for 2 years, cried when I told her what we had found. Not from relief, exactly. From the specific exhaustion of having been right about something for so long and finally being believed. I understood that exhaustion the way you understand a song you've heard all your life. I stayed an extra day. We went through the documentation together, piece by piece. She knew her records. She knew exactly what had happened, and exactly when. She had just needed someone with the right clearance to make it matter. Before I left, she asked me how I had found them, how a financial forensics contractor from DC had ended up in a conference room in eastern Kentucky with her files. "Someone handed me a piece of paper with a name on it," I said, "and I followed it." She nodded. "I hope they know what they started." Cora Eng was living in Portland by then. She had a job at a credit union, a 2-bedroom apartment, a cat she'd named after a Supreme Court justice. She knew what she had started. We talked every few weeks. "There's something I want to say to you, and I want to say it plainly, without the language of inspiration that gets recycled into coffee mugs and Pinterest boards and strips the thing of its actual weight. I spent 23 years trying to be seen by a man who had already decided what I was. I tried harder. I achieved more. I built something real. And for most of those years, I believed that the right combination of effort and patience would eventually change his mind. That if I did enough, he would finally look at me and understand. He never did. Not because I didn't do enough. Because the problem was never about me. The problem was that my existence reminded him of a choice he had made. A version of himself he had traded away for comfort and control. And I was the daily evidence that the trade had cost something real. That is not a problem you can solve by being better. It is not a problem you can solve at all. You can only stop trying to solve it and redirect that energy toward the work that actually needs doing. The work was always there. It was always real. I was always capable of it. I just needed to stop asking permission to begin. If you've been told you're not ready, not qualified, not the right fit, by someone who had every reason to see you clearly and chose not to. I am not going to tell you to forgive them. Forgiveness is a private matter and it moves on its own schedule. What I will tell you is this: the record is still being written. Your name is still in the document, and the only signature that matters on that page is yours. The work doesn't care who your father is. It doesn't care what they said in the conference room. It doesn't care whether someone with power looked up when you walked in or looked through you like you were furniture. It cares whether you show up, whether you do it right, whether you follow the number to the next number and the name to the next name and the truth to wherever it leads, even when no one is watching. I followed it to a federal commendation and a stairwell in Kentucky, and a cat named after a Supreme Court justice, and a junior analyst who finally has her name on her own work. That's the story. All of it, every part that mattered. So wherever you're watching from tonight, whether it's early morning with your coffee or late and you needed something to remind you that being passed over is not the same as being finished, I see you. I don't know your name, but I know the shape of what you're carrying. You don't need their signature. You just need to keep going. Tell me where you're watching from, and if this story found you at the right moment, the way the right story always seems to, I hope you'll stay with us. We'll be back with another one soon. Until then, keep your records, sign your name, and don't let anyone file you away. There's a version of this story I used to tell myself where the point was him, where everything I did was measured against what he thought of me, and the ending only counted if he finally said the words I'd been waiting for since I was about 9 years old. I don't tell that version anymore. Not because it doesn't hurt, it still does, in the specific way that certain things always will, but because I've learned that centering the wrong person in your own story is how you end up spending your life waiting for a verdict that was never going to be fair. What I know now, having lived through it rather than just thought about it, is that the choices compound. Every time my father signed his name where he shouldn't have, every time he buried someone else's work to protect his own position, every time he looked at me across a table and decided I was less than what I was, those choices didn't just affect him. They built a structure, and structures, if you wait long enough, reveal their own weight. That's not fate. That's not punishment from some invisible hand. It's just the plain arithmetic of how decisions accumulate. He made his. I made mine. And the distance between those two sets of choices is where the whole story lives. I think about Opal sometimes, the way she looked when I sat down beside her in that stairwell. She had already done the work. She had already been right. What she was missing wasn't ability or evidence. It was one person willing to put their name next to hers and say, I see what happened here and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That's not heroism. That's just basic decency. But basic decency in the wrong environment can feel like the rarest thing in the world. And Cora, who walked into a federal building with a hard drive and her own name on the line and nothing guaranteed, she is the reason any of it moved, not me. She started it. She had every reason to stay quiet and zero institutional protection if she spoke, and she spoke anyway. That kind of courage doesn't come from calculation. It comes from the part of a person that still believes the truth is worth the cost of telling it. I don't think integrity is something you perform when it's convenient. I think it's a habit you build in small moments. Long before the moment that matters, you document the thing when no one's watching. You sign your name under someone else's when there's no obvious benefit to doing so. You follow the number to the next number even when the work is tedious and the recognition is non-existent. And then one day the structure you've been quietly building, of careful work, of documented truth, of small acts of decency done without audience, turns out to be the only thing still standing. My father built a structure too. His just went the other way. The work is the point. The record is the point. Not the applause, not the title, not whether someone with power looked up when you walked into the room. You keep your records. You sign your name. You show up for the person in the stairwell who has already done the work and just needs someone to see it. That's all. That's the whole thing.